The snow had been falling since dawn. Fine, weightless flakes drifted from a colorless sky, settling over the Appalachian ridgeline like dust on an old photograph. Every sound was softened, absorbed into the endless white, the world reduced to breath. Wood and wind, a thin column of smoke rose from a cabin by the frozen lake. It curled, weak and uncertain, against the gray sky like a signal from someone who'd forgotten what they were signaling for. Inside that cabin lived Jack Mercer. He was a big man, though time and solitude had carved the size out of him, leaving only what was necessary. His beard had gone to winter long before the mountain did, and his eyes, pale, sharp, unyielding, had the color of distant ice. He split wood behind the cabin. Each swing of the axe met with the muffled thud of resignation rather than effort. Every motion was practiced, silent, efficient, the kind of routine that replaces prayer when prayer stops working. Beside him lay Rex, a German shepherd with one gray whisker for every scar on his master's hands. His fur bristled in the cold, and his ears, always alert,
always listening, twitched at the faintest crack in the distance. He was no ordinary dog. Once he had been canine, trained for the kind of work that left men and animals broken in the same invisible places. Now, he was the last witness to Jack Mercer's life, the only creature who knew both the soldier and the man who came after. Jack paused, exhaled, and watched his breath turn to ghosts. 3 winters, old friend, he muttered. His voice was gravel, slow and low, like someone unused to hearing it anymore. 3 winters since we walked away. Rex lifted his head at the sound,
eyes amber and full of something deeper than loyalty memory. Maybe. Jack gave a faint smile and went back to his work. Inside the cabin was a map of his years in exile. A rifle leaned by the door, shelves lined with mason jars, beans, rice, jerky, a lantern flickering against a wall of pine logs, and on the table, beneath a knife and a chipped enamel mug, lay an old leather-bound journal. Jack opened it, thumb tracing the faded ink of an entry written months ago. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, a soldier's handwriting. It's been 3 years since I left the world behind. The noise, the faces, the apologies that came too late. Rex and I have found peace, or something that looks like it. The woods don't ask questions. The snow doesn't care who you were. He stopped reading, eyes lingering on the page. His hand trembled just slightly before he closed the journal and slid it aside. Outside, the wind rose, that low, hollow whistle that only mountains know. Jack stood, pulled on his coat, and stepped out again. The cold hit like truth sharp, clean, unrelenting. He adjusted his scarf, tucked his gloves, and looked toward the tree line that bordered the lake. Somewhere in there, beyond the veil of white, a branch snapped. Rex was already up, his hackles lifted, tail stiff. He gave one low growl, the kind that vibrated more in the air than in sound. Jack froze, listening, his eyes narrowed, scanning the trees. For a moment, there was nothing, only the wind teasing through the pines. Then, another sound, faint, irregular, not the rhythm of falling snow or cracking ice. Footsteps. He reached for the rifle propped against the wall, chambered around with a sound too loud for the silence around them. "Stay," he whispered, though Rex never needed the command. The dog crouched beside the porch, head low, body tense like a drawn bow. Jack stepped into the snow. The first step sank deep crunch. The air burned in his lungs, every breath leaving a trail behind him. The forest loomed, vast and indifferent, its shadows shifting with the wind. He stopped near the tree, every muscle in his body remembering 1,000 patrols, 1,000 nights where danger wore silence as its uniform. He listened, not with his ears but with that deeper sense that soldiers never unlearn. The wind howled once more, pushing through the bare branches. Then came the sound again, closer now. A rustle, a shuffle. He lifted the rifle, eyes steady through the scope. "Who's there?" His voice cut through the cold like the crack of splitting wood. No answer, only the hiss of falling snow. Rex barked once, shab, warning. Jack took another step forward. His boot brushed something under the snow, a broken track. Human leading toward the lake, not fresh, but recent enough to matter. He crouched, brushed the powder aside, and found what he feared, prints too small for a hunter, too uncertain for a local, someone lost or hiding. He rose, exhaled slowly. Damn it. Rex padded to his side, head tilted as if asking the question Jack already knew the answer to. "Yeah," Jack muttered, "we're not alone anymore." The wind picked up, carrying the faint echo of something far, maybe a branch falling, maybe something else. Jack turned back toward the cabin, his shape fading into the swirl of white. Inside, the lantern still burned, its flame shivering in the draft. On the table, the journal lay open again, the last line of ink still wet from that morning. 3 years since I walked away. Peace never stays. It just waits. Jack hung the rifle by the door and knelt beside Rex. Running a hand through his fur, the dog leaned into the touch, letting out a soft grunt, a sound of trust, of understanding between two creatures who've seen too much and said too little. Jack looked toward the dark window where snow pressed against the glass. His reflection, tight eyes, gray beard. The faintest scar along his temple looked back at him like a stranger he used to know. "Another winter, buddy," he said quietly. "Let's make it count." Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, not quite words, not quite memory, and somewhere beyond that darkness, something moved. The flame in the lantern flickered, and the third winter began. The snow always brings the smell back. Not gunpowder, not exactly, but something close. Cold, metal, wet dirt, burnt air, the kind of scent that only lingers after something sacred has been broken. Jack Mercer used to tell himself it was just memory playing tricks on him, but deep down, he knew better. The past doesn't fade. It just buries itself under quieter days, waiting for the wind to shift. And when it does, you remember everything. 3 years earlier, the desert was alive with noise. The night had been still one moment. Chaos the next, fire blooming across the ridge like a sunrise made of hell. The convoy was pinned down, engines burning, radios screaming. Jack's squad, 6 men and 1 canine unit, had been ambushed on a narrow road outside Kandahar. The last thing he remembered before the world turned red was Rex pulling at his sleeve, barking a warning he didn't understand until the explosion hit. The shockwave threw him into the sand. The air turned to glass. He remembered trying to stand, remembered the heat on his face, the screaming that didn't sound human. He remembered grabbing Rex's furs singed, eyes wide, and dragging him behind the wreck of a Humvee while rounds cracked overhead like snapping bones. "Hold the line," someone yelled, but there was no line left to hold. Jack's vision tunneled, blood filled his mouth. He could barely breathe, but his hands never let go of Rex's collar. The dog pressed against him, trembling, snarling at the smoke as it trying to scare the world itself back into order. Then nothing, only silence. He woke in a hospital bed under fluorescent lights that hummed like insects. His right arm was wrapped,
Ribs taped, head pounding. A nurse told him he'd been out for 48 hours. Another told him he was lucky. He didn't feel lucky. He asked about the others. She didn't answer. Days passed in blurs of morphine and bad dreams. The doctors called it survivor's confusion. But confusion implies a lack of clarity, and Jack remembered too much. The sound of the explosion, the heat, the way the sand clung to the skin of the dead. But the faces wouldn't come back. Every time he tried to remember them, they slipped away like smoke in the dark. And that was worse than the pain. That was the real wound. Rex was there when they finally let him outside. The dog limped toward him down the long corridor of the military base. Bandaged and quiet, his left ear was torn, and a faint line of pink ran down his side where the blast had burned through his fur. When their eyes met, something wordless passed between them. Not reunion, not joy, just recognition. "We're still here." That night, the unit chaplain came by. He offered condolences, prayed over names Jack couldn't recall. Then he said something about purpose and healing. Jack had nodded politely.
But when the man left, Jack sat there in the huff, his hand resting on Rex's head, and whispered, "They were better men than me." Rex didn't move, didn't need to. The months after his discharge were a blur of cities and silence. Jack tried to go home, but home had changed, or maybe he had. Crowds made his heart race. Fireworks sent him to the floor. He worked odd jobs, slept in his truck, and spoke to no one but Rex. Every night, he'd wake up gasping, the smell of smoke still in his lungs, the sound of his brothers dying still in his ears. And every morning, Rex would nudge his arm until he sat up again. The VA doctors gave him pills. The pills dulled everything: pain, fear, even memory. He stopped taking them when he realized they also dulled Rex's eyes when he looked at him. So he packed what little he had: a duffel bag, an old rifle, a map. Then he signed the papers to retire Rex officially from service. The handler's note said, "Dog and soldier bonded beyond protocol. Recommend joint discharge beyond protocol." Jack liked that phrase. It meant no one else could understand. He drove west. Miles turned into days, cities into forests, gas stations, rest stops, back roads, until finally the world grew quiet enough for him to hear his own breath again. He didn't know where he was going, only what he was leaving behind. He crossed into the Appalachians just before dawn one autumn morning. The road wound through mist and pine, the kind of silence that holds its breath. On the dashboard, Rex's head rested against the window, ears twitching to some sound only he could hear. When the first snowflake hit the windshield, Jack pulled over. He stepped out. boots crunching on frost. The air bit his face clean, sharp, alive. He looked at Rex and said, "What do you think, partner? Enough ghosts out here for the both of us." Rex gave a quiet woof, tail thumping once against the seat. Jack chuckled, just barely. It was the first time he'd smiled in months. He climbed back into the truck, turned onto a narrow dirt road, and drove until the pavement disappeared altogether. A wooden sign leaned crooked by the roadside, half covered in snow. Appalachian County, population 214. Jack read it twice. Then he shut off the engine. For a long while, he just sat there, hands on the wheel, listening to the tick of the cooling engine and the slow beat of his heart. "This'll do," he whispered finally. Rex barked once, low and certain as if he'd been waiting for those words all along. That was 3 winters ago. Now, the cabin stands where that truck once stopped, and every night, when the wind howls through the trees, Jack still hears the faint echo of a desert far away, the kind that never lets go of what it took. But here, in the heart of the mountains, at least the silence belongs to him, to them.
The storm had passed, but the mountains still wore the silence it left behind. Wind swept through the empty pines, brushing snow off branches like the soft exhale of something ancient. The lake, once full, now half frozen and receded, lay in the hollow of the valley, a pale mirror for the colorless sky. Jack Mercer followed the shoreline, rifle slung over his shoulder, Rex pacing close beside him. They'd been out since morning, tracing deer tracks that led nowhere. The air was heavy with the scent of wet bark and cold earth.
Jack's breath fogged in front of him, fading as quickly as the life he'd left behind. Then he saw it, the barn. It stood crooked against the slope, half swallowed by brush and time. The roof had caved in on one side, the door hung by a single hinge, and one wall leaned outward as if trying to escape its own collapse. It wasn't much, but it was something. Jack stopped a few paces away. Eyes narrowed, Rex sniffed the air, tail low, cautious but curious. "What do you think?" Jack murmured. "Haunted or just forgotten?" Rex gave a short huff, then trotted forward. Nose to the ground, Jack followed, boots crunching through frost and dead leaves. Inside, dust swirled and thin beams of light breaking through the holes in the roof. The air smelled of old hay and rot, but underneath it faintly there was the scent of cedar, the kind that doesn't die even when the years pile high. He ran his hand along one of the beams. It flaked under his touch but held firm enough. He nodded, almost to himself. "This'll do." Rex barked once, sharp and sure, tail wagging. It was settled. The next few days passed without words, only the rhythm of work. Jack cleared the debris first, broken boards, rusted tools, the skeleton of what might have once been a plow. He worked slow, but steady, the way soldiers do when they know there's no backup coming. Each swing of the hammer echoed across the lake, each nail driven like punctuation in the story he didn't yet know he was writing. Rex stayed close, always moving, dragging smaller branches with his teeth, guarding the perimeter, growling whenever the wind carried a sound that didn't belong. Sometimes Jack talked to him while he worked, not because he needed to be heard, but because silence too long unbroken starts to sound like the past. "It used to be, I'd build things to blow up later," Jack muttered one afternoon, sawing through a warped plank. "Feels good to do the opposite for once." Rex tilted his head, tongue out, as if half listening, half amused. "Yeah," Jack said with a faint grin. "Didn't think you'd get the joke either." He scavenged what he could from the old logging site down the ridge, discarded beams, a sheet of tin, even a window frame buried under years of moss. He hauled them back by hand or tied them to a sled when the snow allowed. Rex trotted beside him the whole way, pulling smaller loads strapped with rope around his chest. The sight of the dog trudging through the drifts made Jack's throat tighten. Loyalty like that didn't belong to the world anymore. It was something older, purer. By the end of the second week, the cabin stood straighter. The roof no longer leaked. The door closed without complaint. Inside, the hearth he'd rebuilt from scattered stones breathed again, firelight flickering across rough walls, catching in Rex's eyes as the dog lay curled nearby. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For the first time in years, Jack felt something shift inside him, not joy, not peace, but the faintest echo of belonging, a place that didn't demand he be anything other than alive. One evening, while the sky bled into dusk, Jack sat outside with a block of cedar and his old army knife. The air was still, save for the occasional creak of settling wood. Rex lay at his feet, head resting on his paws. Half asleep, Jack carved slowly, the way one writes a letter that will never be sent. Shavings curled away in the firelight. Letters took shape, uneven, deliberate, each one carrying the weight of years he'd spent trying to disappear. When he was done, he held it up. The words were rough, but clear enough under the fading light. The SHLTR, he stared at it a long time, thumb brushing over the grooves. "It's not just a roof," he said softly, almost to himself. "It's where we stopped running." Rex raised his head, ears perked at the sound of his voice. Jack smiled faintly, the kind of smile that hurts before it heals. "Yeah, boy," he murmured, "this is ours." He nailed the sign to the front beam just as the first stars appeared above the ridge. The hammer strikes rang through the still air, 3 solid blows that felt like the final lines of a vow. That night, the fire burned low but steady. Jack sat by it, sipping from a tin cup of boiled lake water. The warmth crawled through his chest, settling the ghosts that always came with darkness. Rex lay close, chin on Jack's boot, eyes half closed but awake enough to listen. Jack leaned back, staring into the orange glow. "You know," he said, voice hoarse, "they used to say home is where someone waits for you." He paused. "Guess they never thought it could just be a dog and a stubborn old man in the woods." Rex's tail thumped once soft, slow. Jack chuckled under his breath. "Still," he continued, setting the cup down, eyes fixed on the dancing flames, "no one can take this from us. Not the world. Not the past. Nobody." For a moment, he could almost believe it. The fire cracked, sending a spark drifting upward, disappearing into the chimney. Outside, the lake was still, the mountains holding their breath. The sign on the wall creaked softly in the cold, the shelter as if whispering its name back to them. And for the first time since the war, Jack Mercer slept without reaching for his rifle. Morning always came quietly in the mountains. The mist rolled off the frozen lake, thin as breath, wrapping around the pines like a shroud. Jack Mercer stood by the cabin door, coffee steaming in a tin mug, watching Rex stretch in the pale light. The dog's fur shimmered with frost, his ears twitching to the distant calls of unseen birds. Life had found its rhythm again, slow, simple, honest. Every day began the same way now. Jack split wood by the lake, his breath fogging the air. Then, with his rifle slung across his back, he and Rex hiked into the woods. Sometimes they hunted rabbit or deer. Sometimes they just walked in silence, listening to the sound of snow breaking underfoot. The forest didn't ask questions, it didn't demand apologies. It simply existed, cold, steady, indifferent. In that indifference, Jack found peace. At noon, they'd fish in the stream that cut through the valley clear. Glacial water where trout flickered like silver ghosts. Rex would sit on the bank, tails sweeping the snow, eyes tracking every move Jack made. When Jack's line caught something, Rex would bark once, short and proud, as if announcing a victory they both shared. Jack chuckled each time. "Good boy," he'd say softly. "Couldn't do it without you." In the evenings, they worked the small garden patch Jack had carved from the frozen soil behind the cabin. He'd learned which roots could survive the cold: carrots, onions, a few herbs. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. When he looked at the small shoots pushing through frost, he felt something shift inside him, something that might one day resemble hope. Some days, though, the rhythm faltered. There were mornings when Jack couldn't get out of bed. When the ghosts of war returned, the gunfire, the smell of metal and smoke, the screams. On those mornings, the air in the cabin felt heavy, and Jack's eyes stared at the ceiling, empty. That was when Rex would act. He'd nudge Jack's arm softly at first, then harder. If Jack didn't move, Rex barked sharp, commanded, the kind of sound that refused to be ignored. Jack groaned, covering his face with his hand. "Not today, Rex." Rex barked again, then he tugged the blanket off the bed. It made Jack laugh, the first laugh in days. He sat up slowly, rubbing his face. All right, you win." They'd go outside together, Rex running ahead, Jack following with slow, heavy steps. The cold wind would bite his skin, but it reminded him he was alive. That was enough. One night, by the fire, Jack took out his hunting knife. Its wooden handle had long been worn smooth by years of use. With a small carving tool, he began etching Rex's image into the grip, careful, deliberate strokes. The firelight glinting off the blade, Rex lay beside him, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed. "This one's for you," Jack murmured. "You're not just a dog. You're what's left of the best part of me." He didn't expect Rex to understand, but the dog lifted his head, ears perked, and pressed his muzzle gently against Jack's knee. Jack smiled, a faint, tired smile. "Yeah, I know. You feel it too." A week later, a letter arrived. It came in the hands of a delivery driver from town, a rare visitor in those parts. Jack found it odd to see his name written again in someone else's handwriting. He hadn't seen that in years.
The envelope was from Mason, the old owner of the general store down in Ash Grove. "Jack, I know you don't come by much. Folks around here still talk about you, the quiet guy in the woods with the big dog. If you ever need anything, food, supplies, or just someone to talk to, my door's open. Don't let the silence swallow you whole. No man's meant to live alone forever. Mason Jack folded the letter carefully, set it on the table, and stared at it for a long while. People mean well, he whispered, but they don't understand. He looked over at Rex, who was gnawing a stick near the fire. You get it,
don't you? Out there it's too loud, too bright, too many ghosts walking in daylight. Rex looked up, tail thumping once. Jack chuckled. Guess I've already got someone to talk to. That night, the wind howled outside, rattling the wooden walls of the shelter. Jack sat by the fire, reading from an old book he'd found in the cabin, The Old Man and the Sea. He read aloud, his voice low and rough, and Rex listened as if he understood every word. When Jack closed the book, the fire had burned low. He reached down, resting a hand on Rex's head. You know, he said softly, maybe Mason's right. Maybe no one should live alone forever, but if I had to, I'd rather it be with you. Rex shifted closer, his body warm against Jack's leg. The snow kept falling outside, silent and endless. The lake was frozen, the trees asleep, but inside that small cabin, beneath the flicker of the dying fire, there was life, fragile, stubborn, and quietly beautiful. Jack looked down at his old companion and whispered, maybe you're the reason I'm still here. Rex, and for the first time in a long time. His voice didn't sound like it belonged to a man waiting to die, but to someone learning, slowly, to live again. The morning Jack decided to walk to town, the sky was the color of pewter, heavy, unbroken, cold, the kind of day when sound seemed to sink straight into the snow. He strapped on his old pack, slung a few animal pelts across his shoulder, and looked down at Rex. 15 miles. Boy, you up for it? Rex's tail wagged once, slow but certain. The trail wound down from the mountains, tracing along the frozen creek before cutting through a valley where the snow was thinner. The air smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke for 3 winters. Jack had looked down at that valley from afar, a place of voices, engines, and faint lights at night. Now, for the first time, he was walking into it. By the time they reached the edge of town, the sun was already sinking behind the ridge. Ash Grove was small, 1 main street, 2 gas pumps, a diner, and a few stores with faded paint and hanging Christmas lights left over from the last decade. Jack's boots left dark prints on the slush-covered road. People watched him through frosted windows, the tall man with the beard and the old army jacket, walking with the dog that looked like it belonged to a police unit. He didn't blame them for staring. He barely recognized himself anymore. When he reached the general store, a hand-painted sign swung gently in the wind. Mason's Supply and Goods. Jack hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open. The bell jingled, sharp in the quiet air. Inside smelled like sawdust, coffee, and old rope. Behind the counter stood a broad-shouldered man in his 60s, gray hair trimmed close, sleeves rolled up despite the cold. He looked up from a ledger and froze for half a second. Well, I'll be damned, he said with a grin. You must be the mountain ghost everyone keeps talking about. Jack managed a small nod. Name's Mercer. Jack Mercer. Jack Mercer. The man's eyes flicked to Rex. His smile softened. And that's a K9, isn't he? Chuck said. Army dog. We retired together. The man stepped around the counter, hand extended. Mason, U.S. Navy. Once upon a time. Jack shook it firm, brief, but respectful. There was a kind of quiet recognition between them, the unspoken language of those who had seen too much and said too little. For the next hour, they talked as Mason helped him trade pelts for canned food, coffee, salt, a small sack of seeds, and a bottle of penicillin for Rex's paw. Mason moved easy, like a man used to both solitude and small company. He spoke in an even, gravelly tone, and every so often, he'd glance at Rex with a faint, knowing smile. You take good care of that dog, Mason said. You can tell he's seen hell, same as you. Jack looked up. He saved my life once. Probably more than once. That's so? Jack nodded, eyes distant. Afghanistan, ambush outside coast. My team didn't make it out. Rex pulled me from the blast. Mason paused. The silence stretched, filled only by the hum of the heater and the faint rattle of the windows. Then, quietly, he said, I lost men in Nam. Whole patrol gone in a flash flood. I remember the way the air smelled that night, diesel and mud. I think about it every damn day. Jack's jaw tightened. Does it ever fade? Mason shook his head slowly. You just learned to carry it better. They both stood there a while. 2 old soldiers in a store that smelled of pine soap and gun oil, bound by the invisible thread of what they'd survived. As Jack packed his goods, Mason poured 2 cups of coffee from a battered metal pot and slid one across the counter. "Don't get many visitors from the mountain," he said. "Most folks say it's haunted." Jack smirked faintly. "Maybe it is. Haunted places suit haunted men," Mason replied with a chuckle. "Still, you look better than I expected." "Better? Yeah, you've got work in your hands again, purpose in your eyes. That's something." Jack stared into his cup, steam curling up like a ghost between them. "I wouldn't call it purpose, more like survival." Mason leaned forward. "Same thing. Some days, outside, the wind picked up, scattering bits of snow against the glass." Rex shifted beside Jack's chair, alert but calm, his eyes following every movement. Mason's gaze softened as he watched the dog. "You know, I once read that some soldiers come home, and their bodies forget how to fight but their souls never stop. Maybe that's what you're doing up there, teaching your soul to breathe again." Jack looked up, caught off guard by the simple truth of it. After a long silence, Mason said quietly, "You're not hiding, Jack. You're rebuilding." The words landed like a hand on his shoulder, solid, grounding. Jack swallowed hard, then nodded. "Maybe. Just trying to make something that won't fall apart again." Mason smiled, the kind that came from somewhere deep and genuine. "That's all any of us ever try to do." When Jack stepped back outside, the sky was violet, the first stars beginning to shimmer above the mountains. He adjusted his pack, gave Mason a final nod, and said, "Thanks for the trade and the talk. Come by more often," Mason said. "The road gets shorter when you've got somewhere to walk to." Jack glanced down at Rex, who wagged his tail once, as if agreeing. They started back up the snowy trail. The lights of the small town faded behind them, swallowed by the trees. But for the first time in years, Jack felt the faint, almost forgotten warmth of belonging not to a place, but to the idea that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't entirely gone from the world. The wind whispered through the pines as he walked,
carrying Mason's words like a promise into the cold night. "You're not hiding, Jack. You're rebuilding your life." And for the first time since the war, Jack believed it might be true.
The snow that morning was heavier than usual, thick, quiet, endless. Jack had learned to read the forest, the subtle shifts in sound, the language of stillness. But that day, something was wrong. The silence wasn't peace. It was warning. Rex sensed it first. They were chopping wood behind the shelter when the dog froze, ears pointed toward the ridge. His growl was low, uncertain, the kind of sound that didn't come from curiosity, but threat. Jack set the axe down slowly. "What is it, boy?" Rex bolted toward the tree line, nose down, tail stiff. Jack followed, rifle slung tight against his shoulder. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he climbed the ridge, his breath sharp in the cold. Then he saw a row of steel traps, glinting like teeth under the frost. Fresh boot prints surrounded them. Hunters. Jack knelt beside one, jaw tightening. He could tell by the tracks. 3, maybe 4 men, big ones. They'd come close the close, and the traps weren't meant for deer. The spacing, the bait, the angles, these were for predators, wolves, coyotes, or maybe anything that moved. Rex barked once, then twice, more urgent now, and then the crack of a rifle. The shot echoed through the trees, cutting the quiet clean in half. Snow burst beside Rex, spraying into the air. The dog yelped, stumbled, and went down. Rex. Jack dove forward, hard hammering. Another shot rang out, splintering a pine trunk inches from his head. He hit the ground hard, dragged himself behind a fallen log, and returned fire, one clean shot toward the direction of the smoke flash. The forest fell silent again, for a long, breathless moment. Nothing moved. Then Jack crawled to Rex. The dog whimpered, blood staining the white snow around his leg, high on the shoulder. A clean through shot, but bad enough to cripple. Jack's hands trembled. "Stay with me, buddy. You hear me? Stay." He tore open his pack, the old field medic training kicking in through the panic. He pressed gauze, wrapped the wound, tied it with what he had. His breath came fast and shallow, his voice shaking as he worked. "Don't you die on me, Rex. Not you. Not after everything." The forest watched in silence, snow falling softly around them, as if the world refused to see the pain beneath it. Hours passed. Jack carried Rex home through the storm, one arm under the dog's chest, the other gripping his rifle. By the time they reached the cabin, his clothes were stiff with ice, his hands raw. Inside, he laid Rex by the fire, fed the flames until the cabin glowed orange. Blood soaked through the bandage. Jack cleaned it again, sterilized it with alcohol. His jaw clenched so tight it hurt. When the worst was done, he sat back on his heels, staring at the rise and fall of Rex's chest. Every few minutes, he'd reach out to check the dog's pulse, whispering words that barely made sound. "No more. You understand? I won't lose another one. Not you." He sat there all night, never moving, never sleeping, just listening to the wind clawing at the windows and Rex's slow, uneven breathing. By dawn, the bleeding had stopped. Rex stirred weakly, eyes fluttering open. His ears twitched when Jack spoke. "Hey there, soldier," Jack murmured. You pulled through. Rex's tail moved once, a faint, fragile sign of life. Jack exhaled shakily, pressing his forehead to the dog's side. The sound that escaped him wasn't quite a sob, but it wasn't far from one either. Days turned into weeks. The snow kept falling. The traps disappeared after Jack destroyed them all, and life slowed back to the quiet rhythm of healing. Rex couldn't walk at first. Every step was pain, his legs stiff and trembling. Jack built him a sling from old rope and cloth, helping him stand, supporting his weight with both hands. "Easy, boy," he whispered, "one step at a time." Each morning, Rex tried again. He'd fall, growl, to struggle to rise, but he never gave up. And each time he stood, Jack's chest tightened with something wordless and deep. By the third week, Rex could limp to the door by himself. Jack sat by the threshold, watching as the dog stepped out into the snow, sunlight gleaming on the scar that now marked his shoulder. Rex paused, lifted his head toward the trees, and barked once, strong, defiant. Jack smiled, the kind of small, quiet smile that came from deep gratitude. He knelt beside Rex, resting a hand on his fur. "We're both patched up now, Hal. You've got your scar. I've got mine." Rex looked up, eyes bright and alive again. Jack's voice dropped to a whisper. "We all carry marks, buddy. The difference is we're still breathing." That night, the firelight danced across the cabin walls, throwing long shadows that looked almost human. Jack sat in his chair, Rex asleep at his feet, his leg bandaged but healing. The world outside was the same as ever, cold, brutal, vast, but inside the shelter, warmth held its ground. Jack poured a small measure of whiskey into a tin cup and raised it toward the fire. "Two scars," he said quietly, "the ones we see and the ones we don't." He drank, and the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of memory, loss, survival, and the fragile, stubborn bond that refused to die, even when everything else had. Rex stirred in his sleep, tail twitching once, as if to say, "I'm still here." Jack leaned back, eyes closing, voice barely a murmur. "Yeah, you are," he whispered, "and so am I." The first signs came with the wind, a low hum across the lake, the kind that creeps beneath the door, whispers through the cracks, and settles inside your bones. Jack knew it before he even looked outside. He'd felt storms like this before, not in the sky, but on the battlefield. That same sense of pressure, that waiting hush before everything turns violent. Rex sensed it too. He paced by the door, fur bristling, eyes locked on the horizon. The lake was swelling, gray and angry, waves slapping against the frozen shore. Jack threw on his coat and stepped out. The air was sharp enough to cut. The wind screamed down from the mountains, dragging snow in wild spirals. Clouds were stacking low, black against the peaks. He muttered to himself, "Hell's waking up." And then, as if the world had been holding its breath, the storm broke. The wind hit first, a roar that shook the pines and ripped through the cabin's roof like claws. Snow came sideways, thick and furious, swallowing the world in white. Jack slammed the door shut, barred it with a beam. The fire guttered, the sparks leaping into the air like frightened birds. "Rex!" He shouted over the wind, grabbed the rope, the one by the stove. Rex barked once, sharp, and ran toward the corner. The old canine was slower now, the scar on his leg still stiff, but his eyes burned with focus. Jack snatched the rope, tying it across the main beam to brace the wall. Every creak of wood felt like a heartbeat too close to breaking. The roof groaned. Jack looked up. The Kelowna was peeling back, snow pouring in through the gap like ghostly smoke. He climbed the ladder, pushing against the shingles, hammering down nails with numb fingers. The cold bit into his hands, blood freezing on contact. His breath came ragged, the wind howling like the cry of something ancient. Below him, Rex barked again, warning. A crash. The window shattered. The storm rushed inside, tearing through the room in a frenzy of snow and splinters. Papers flew, tools scattered. Jack jumped down, grabbed the top, and fought the wind to cover the opening. His muscles screamed. He shouted into the chaos. Voice roar, "You'll have to do better than that." The storm answered with thunder, a deep, rolling growl that shook the ground. Hours blurred. There was no night, no day, only white. Jack worked in silence now, moving with mechanical precision, patch, tie, hammer, seal. His hands bled freely. His eyes burned from smoke and wind. Every time he thought he was done, another piece of the world came apart. And through it all, Rex stayed by his side, dragging blankets, pushing at fallen planks, barking when the fire dimmed too low. When Jack stumbled, Rex pressed against his leg, steadying him. When Jack coughed from the smoke, Rex poured at his arm, eyes fierce. In that chaos, they weren't man and dog. They were two survivors fighting the same war again, side by side. By midnight, the shelter looked less like a cabin and more like a battlefield. Half the roof was buckets caught the dripping melt. The fire roared high, fed by every piece of broken wood Jack could find. He sat by it, choked as shaking, soaked through and exhausted. His breath came in rough, wet gasps. Rex lay beside him, chest heaving. Outside, the world screamed. Inside, there was only the crackle of fire and the faint hum of survival. Jack reached out, his voice hoarse. "You still with me, partner?" Rex's tail moved once. That was enough. Jack looked into the flames, eyes glassy. "The storm's not here to kill us," he whispered. "It's here to see if we deserve to stay." He said it again, quieter this time, almost like a prayer. Sometime near dawn, the wind began to die. The silence that followed was deafening. The fire had burned down to embers, the air heavy with ash and smoke. Jack didn't move for a long time. He just sat there staring at the door, waiting to see if the world outside still existed. When he finally opened it, the light hit him like grace. The world was buried, trees bent under the weight of snow, the lake frozen solid, the mountains veiled in white mist. But it was still there, alive. Jack stepped outside, boots sinking deep. The air was clean, bright, silent. He turned to see Rex limping behind him, nose to the wind. They stood together at the edge of the lake. The storm had carved the land raw, but it had also revealed something, the strength of what refused to fall. Jack looked up at the battered cabin, smoke still rising weakly from the chimney. It had survived. He knelt beside Rex, rubbing the dog's neck, voice low and rough. "Guess we passed the test, Rex pressed against him, eyes half closed. Jack smiled faintly, the kind of smile only earned through pain and persistence. "Storms don't come to destroy," he murmured. "They come to find out what's worth keeping." The wind brushed past them one last time, soft now, like a sigh. Jack looked over the frozen lake, the wrecked trees, the silent mountains. Everything had changed, and yet he was still standing. Rex barked once, breaking the quiet. Jack nodded. "Yeah, we're still here." And as the sun broke through the clouds, a single beam cutting through the frost and ruin, the shelter stood tall behind them, scarred but unbroken. So were they. The world was silent again. Not the kind of silence that comes from emptiness, but the kind that follows chaos when the earth itself pauses to breathe. Snow melted slowly off the roof of the shelter. Each drop of water fell into the puddles around the cabin, echoing like the slow rhythm of a heartbeat returning to life. Jack stepped outside, his boots sinking into the wet soil. The trees were heavy with frost, but light broke through their branches, thin, trembling shafts of gold slicing through the morning fog. For the first time in weeks, the lake shimmered again. It wasn't the cold, lifeless mirror it had been before the storm. It rippled softly, reflecting a sky that seemed to forgive. Jack stood there a long time, breathing it in. His coat was torn, his hands cracked and red from the long night. But in that pale sunlight, the lines of exhaustion on his face softened. Behind him, Rex limped out from the doorway. The old shepherd's part still bore the mark of the hunter's bullet, but he moved with quiet strength, slow, deliberate, unyielding. Jack crouched beside him, rubbing the fur behind his ears. "We made it again, buddy," he whispered. "Didn't think the old place would hold." Rex pressed his head against Jack's leg, letting out a low, contented rumble. Inside, the fire was still burning low in the stove. The scent of pine smoke and damp earth filled the small cabin. On the table lay a notebook, its pages wrinkled from humidity, its cover marked field notes. Jack sat down, opened it, and began to write in slow, heavy strokes. "Maybe I didn't die out there," he wrote. "Maybe I was just waiting to start living again. The storm came to remind me there's still work to do." He paused, staring at the words. They didn't sound like the voice of a broken man anymore. They sounded steady. "Hold," Rex barked suddenly, a short, sharp sound alert. Curious. Jack looked up. "What is it?" The dog stood by the open door, ears pricked toward the treelet. Then came another sound, a faint, desperate whimper carried by the wind. Jack rose, heart tightening. He grabbed his coat, slung the rifle over his shoulder out of habit, and followed Rex into the woods. The snow had begun to soften into slush. Each step sank deeper into the ground, and then, just beyond a fallen birch, he saw at a small, trembling shape half buried in the snow. A pup, maybe 4 months old, ribs visible beneath its fur. It tried to back away, but its back leg was tangled in a branch. Jack knelt beside it, moving slow, voice low. Easy now, hey, I'm not gonna hurt you. Rex stood beside him, watching. The older dog's ears flicked forward, then relaxed. He gave a soft huff. As if granting permission, Jack freed the pup. Checked its leg, it wasn't broken, just sore. He wrapped it gently in his scarf and lifted it against his chest. Guess the storm didn't take everyone, he murmured. Back at the shelter, Jack dried the pup by the fire. The little thing, brown fur with a white stripe across its nose, shivered until it found warmth beneath Rex's chin. Rex sniffed her, circled twice, and then, surprisingly, lay down beside her. The pup nestled close without hesitation. Jack smiled, leaning back in his chair. Well, Rex, looks like you've got yourself an apprentice. The old shepherd looked up at him, tail thumping once against the floor. Over the next few days, the cabin filled with a new kind of sound, like paws scampering across wood, playful growls, the clatter of a tin bowl being chased across the floor. Rex, the ever-serious soldier, became a teacher. He showed the pup, whom Jack eventually named Nova, how to circle the perimeter, how to bark twice when hearing movement, how to wait at the door until Jack's call. It was clumsy at first, but Nova learned fast. She followed Rex everywhere, into the woods, to the lakeshore, even to the small garden where Jack had started planting again. One afternoon, Jack sat by the water's edge, watching them. The air smelled of thawing soil and pine. The world felt awake again. He looked at the reflection of the three of them in the lake: man, old dog, young pup, and for the first time, the image didn't feel lonely. He spoke quietly, almost to himself. You were right, Mason, he said. We don't build a life by hiding. We build it by keeping something alive. Rex barked once in response. Nova yipped after him, echoing the sound like a promise. Jack laughed softly, a sound that surprised even him. It had been so long since laughter didn't hurt. The sun dipped lower, turning the lake gold. Jack reached down and skinned a hand through the cold water. Even in the quiet, he thought, life finds its way back. He stood, brushing the dirt off his hands, and looked toward the horizon, the path that led beyond the woods, beyond the years he thought he'd lost. Inside, the carved sign above the door still read "The Shelter," its letters rough but steady. Jack ran his hand across the wood as he entered, feeling the grain beneath his fingertips the same way you might touch a scar that no longer hurts. Rex and Nova curled together near the fire. Already asleep, the storm had taken much, but it had given something back to prove that even the broken things can hold warmth again. Jack whispered, as if to the night itself. Yeah, even in the middle of nowhere, the light still finds us. And outside, the wind carried his words across the thawing lake, soft, steady, and alive. The morning began like any other, quiet, with the lake still wearing its thin veil of mist. Jack was repairing the handle of an old axe when he heard the familiar growl of an engine coming up the gravel road. A beat-up pickup truck rolled into view, its tires kicking up dirt. Behind the wheel was Mason, his gray beard fluttering in the wind, a grin half hidden beneath the brim of his cap. But this time, he wasn't alone. Two men sat in the truck bed, wrapped in worn coats, their faces drawn and tired. One of them couldn't have been more than the other had eyes that looked far older than his age. Jack wiped his hands on his jeans, watching as the truck stopped beside the shelter. Mason climbed out first. Morning, Jack, he called out. Brought you some company. Hope you don't mind. Jack frowned. Company? Couple of fellas I met down by the freight yard, Mason said, nodding toward them. Veterans. Been sleeping under bridges since fall. I thought maybe. Jack raised a hand, cutting him off. Mason, this isn't a halfway house. I know, Mason said quietly. It's a place that stood through a storm, and maybe that's what they need to see. For a long moment, only the wind spoke. Rex barked once, standing between Jack and the newcomers, tail still but eyes alert. Finally, Jack sighed. Couple of days, he muttered. No promises. Mason's eyes softened. That's all they need. The two men introduced themselves later that evening. Name's Luke, said the younger one, rubbing his hands by the fire. His knuckles were raw from cold and hard labor. Served in Afghanistan, engineering unit. Ethan, the other said simply. A medic like Jack once was.
His voice had that steady tone, the kind you get after you've seen too much and said too little. Jack nodded. You can stay, but you pull your weight. There's wood to chop and traps to check. They nodded, eager, grateful. Over the next few days, the shelter buzzed with new life. Luke helped patch the roof where the storm had left its mark, climbing like a squirrel and joking about how the place reminded him of his grandfather's cabin. Ethan mended fishing lines, collected herbs, and showed Jack how to make antiseptic salve from pine resin. Rex kept a close eye on them both.
Every time Luke got too close to the meat rack or moved too fast near the fire, Rex gave a low growl, not hostile, just a reminder. It became something of a running joke. Guess he's the real sergeant here. Luke laughed one night. Jack smiled faintly. He's got higher standards than most commanding officers I knew. The laughter that followed was easy, natural. It felt strange in the cabin but good. On the third evening, snow began to fall again, gentle this time. Soft flakes that whispered instead of roared. The men sat around the fire, sharing canned beans and stories that carried ghosts in them. Luke spoke about his nightmares, the ones where sand turned to snow and his friends disappeared in the white. Ethan said little, just kept turning a pocket knife in his hands, the blade reflecting the flame. Jack listened. He didn't offer advice, didn't talk about his own ghosts. He just sat there, the firelight flickering across his scarred hands, and let them speak. When the silence returned, Jack stood, grabbed the knife from Ethan, and held it up to the light. "You keep the edge to fine," he said. "It'll chip if you hit bone." He walked to his workbench, picked up a sharpening stone, and began to show them slow, steady motions. His voice, low but clear. "This isn't about perfection," he said. "It's about endurance. You don't sharpen to make it pretty, you sharpen to keep it alive." The two men watched him closely, every stroke echoing like a lesson. Later, Luke tried his hand. Fumbling at first, the edge came out uneven. Jack took the blade, inspected it, then handed it back. "Try again," he said. "And this time, don't rush it." It wasn't just about knives anymore. And they all knew it. Rex and Nova slept near the fire, their bodies rising and falling in unison. The storm outside deepened, but inside, warmth spread through the room like something earned, not given. Luke leaned back, eyes heavy. "Didn't think I'd find a place like this again," he murmured. Ethan added quietly, "Or a man like you." Jack shook his head. "I'm no savior, just someone who got tired of running, still." Mason's voice echoed in his mind. "You're not hiding, you're rebuilding." He glanced toward the two men, exhausted, yes, but alive in a way they hadn't been days ago, and felt something stir in his chest. By morning, the storm had passed. The world outside glowed silver and new. Luke and Ethan were already up, chopping firewood in rhythm, breath and motion, strike and lift. Rex watched from the porch, tail swaying with the slow pride of an old mentor. Jack stood in the doorway, coffee steaming in his hands, a small smile hidden under his beard. For the first time in years, a shelter felt like more than just a refuge. It was becoming a home, a place that taught men to start again. He stepped outside, crunching snow under his boots, and called out, "Ethan, Luke, when you're done there, I'll show you how to track deer prints before they melt. You'll need the skill if you plan to stay." Ethan looked up, half grinning. "Stay? You mean that?" Jack shrugged. "If you can keep up," Rex barked once, sharp and approving. Nova joined in, high-pitched and eager. Luke laughed. "Sounds like we've been recruited." Jack turned toward the lake, sunlight breaking across the water like a second dawn. "No," he said quietly, "we're just coming home." And in that moment, surrounded by the hum of life, the warmth of fire, the echo of laughter, Jack realized that the shelter had become something larger than him. It was no longer just a place to survive. It was a place to return. The first light of spring broke over the Appalachian ridges, melting the last traces of frost that clung to the earth. Mist rose from the lake in slow, ghostly curls, wrapping the shelter in a soft white veil. Jack Mercer stood outside, hammer in hand, next to a slab of old pine he'd sanded smooth, the scent of fresh wood mixed with the sharp morning air. Mason held the other end steady, his breath clouding as he smiled. "Feels like you're building a church," Mason said. Jack chuckled under his breath. "Maybe I am. Just one where no one has to kneel." The two men lifted the sign upright and bolted it into the post. When they stepped back, the sunlight caught the letters Jack had carved with careful, uneven strokes, "The shelter for those who'd been left behind." For a moment, neither spoke. The world seemed to hold its breath, the forest, the wind, the silent ghosts who once marched beside them. Mason nodded slowly. "It's more than a name now." Jack looked at the sign, eyes tracing the cracks in the wood. "Names fade," he said softly, "but places like this, they remember." Life at the shelter took on a rhythm that felt almost sacred. Luke and Ethan had stayed, choosing the quiet over the noise of the world beyond. They built garden beds from old lumber, lined them with stone, and planted the first rows of cabbage, beans, and potatoes. Nova darted between their legs, chasing a robin, while Rex, older now but still strong, lay on the porch, his gaze sweeping the horizon like a silent guardian. Jack moved among them, fixing what broke, mending what wore thin. His hands, once made for war, had learned to heal wood, earth, and hearts. One evening, the group gathered by the fire pit Mason had helped dig behind the cabin. The flames licked at the air, sending embers into the dark sky. The night was peaceful, the kind that asks for stories. Ethan was the first to speak. "I used to think survival meant staying alive," he said, voice low. "But now I think it's more about learning to live again." Luke nodded, throwing a twig into the fire. "Yeah, guess it's easier when you've got someone watching your six." Rex gave a soft huff. As if agreeing, Jack smiled faintly. He'd been silent most of the night, listening to the crackle of the fire and the laughter between men who no longer felt like strangers. Finally, Mason looked over and asked, "What about you, Jack? You've got that look like you've been carrying a story around too long." Jack stared into the flames for a long moment. The reflection shimmered in his eyes like memory. "When I came here," he began quietly, "I thought I was done with the world, thought if I stayed quiet long enough, the noise would stop." The others listened in stillness. Rex was the only one who understood. He continued, "We'd lost too much to go back. And out here it was just us. The woods, the wind, the ghosts." He paused, reaching down to scratch behind Rex's ear. The old shepherd lifted his head, eyes bright in the firelight. "One night," Jack said, "I woke up from a dream, saw all the faces of the ones who didn't make it, and I realized something." He looked up, meeting their eyes. "They didn't die so we could hide. They died so we could remember what mattered." The fire popped, sending sparks spiraling upward like tiny souls returning to the stars. Jack's voice grew steadier,
the rough edge of grief softening into something like peace. "This place," he said, gesturing around them, "it isn't just for me. It's for anyone who's still trying to come back, from war, from loss, from whatever hell they've been through." Ethan swallowed hard. Luke stared into the flames, jaw clenched. Mason nodded slowly, pride and sorrow mingling in his eyes. Jack looked down at Rex again. "He's been my anchor, my reason to keep breathing. But now, maybe that reason's a little bigger." He looked around the fire at these men who had arrived broken and were slowly becoming whole again.
"We can't fight the past," Jack said softly, "but we can build something that outlasts it." The next morning, the four of them worked in silence, setting stones around the garden, fixing the roof shingles loosened by the winter storm. Rex trotted beside them, keeping rhythm, while Nova followed behind, tail wagging like a metronome of joy. When the sun reached its peak, Jack stood beside the wooden sign again, wiping sweat from his brow. He could hear the others laughing behind him, Mason teasing Luke about his crooked hammering, Ethan humming an old tune from his service days. Jack touched the carved letters lightly, tracing the words for those who'd been left behind. He realized then that the shelter had become more than wood and stone. It was a promise, a living memory, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was surviving. He felt alive. That night, they sat by the fire again. The stars stretched endless above the trees, clear and sharp. The fire crackled softly. Jack broke the silence with a single line, half thought, half prayer. "We're not fighting for anyone else anymore," he said, his voice low and certain. "We're fighting to hold on to each other." Rex raised his head, ears twitching. Nova snuggled closer to him. The others sat in silence, the words sinking deep, settling into them like warmth on a cold night. Above them, the stars shone steady over the shelter. And for the first time in a long, long while, Jack Mercer felt that the war inside him had finally gone quiet. The morning the government came, the woods were unnaturally quiet. Jack Mercer stood by the garden, hands buried in the soil, when he heard the crunch of tires on the frozen dirt road. It wasn't a local truck. The hum of its engine carried that flat, official rhythm he'd learned to fear. Rex's ears perked. Nova barked once, sharp and uncertain. Two vehicles rolled into the clearing, white SUV, clean and out of place amid the mud and pine, the kind of vehicles that never came without questions. A woman stepped out first, mid-40s, gray blazer, clipboard in hand. Behind her, a younger man followed, phone already raised to take photos. "Mr. Mercer," she called, her tone polite but clipped. "Jack Mercer." Jack straightened slowly. His palms were covered in earth, his face unreadable. "That's me," he said. She nodded once, stepping closer. "I'm Sarah Wella, with the Department of Social and Housing Services. We received a report about an unregistered structure operating as a residence," and she glanced at a clipboard, "a potential community shelter." Jack wiped his hands on his jeans, his voice low. "It's just a home, for me and a few others." Wella looked around the cabin, the smoke rising from the stovepipe. the small vegetable plots greening under the early spring sun. Everything about it was simple, quiet, and undeniably alive. Still, her expression stayed professional. "We'll need to take a look inside." Standard inspection. Jack hesitated. Years of isolation pressed against his chest. The thought of strangers walking through his world, through the fragile peace he'd built, felt like someone digging through his soul, but he nodded. "All right, come on in. Inside." The inspectors moved with cautious curiosity. They took photos of the handmade furniture, the neatly stacked firewood, the shelves of canned food and tools. The younger man peeked into the back room, where Luke and Ethan were cleaning rifles. Wella frowned. "Are those registered weapons?" Jack answered calmly. "All legal. Hunting permits are posted by the door." Mason entered just then, his boots crunching snow. "Morning," he said, tipping his hat. "I heard the law was paying a visit." Wella turned to him. "And you are?" "Mason Clock. I run the supply store down in town. I've known Jack for years." He paused, eyeing her clipboard. "What's this about?" "We're investigating whether Mr. Mercer is residing here unlawfully," she explained. "There's concern about safety, and about the individuals living with him." Mason gave a dry chuckle. "Safety? Lady, this man's built safer walls than most folks I know. You won't find better order than what's in this place." The younger inspector looked skeptical. "Still, this isn't a registered shelter. Technically, it could be shut down." Rex barked once, startling him. Jack placed a hand on the dog's neck. "Easy, boy, then." To the officials, "You can walk around, ask what you need, but before you make a decision, talk to the people this place has saved." They did. Ethan showed them the garden. Luke explained the water filtration system they'd built from salvaged pipe and gravel. Mason led them to the workshop where handmade knives and tools were laid out for trade. Nova trailed after them, wagging her tail, as if reminding them that this place wasn't about laws, it was about life. When they returned to the porch, Wella looked different. Her clipboard hung loosely at her side. "I'll admit," she said quietly, "I didn't expect this." Jack met her eyes. "Didn't expect what?" "That something built out of nothing could run better than most programs we fund." Her partners shifted awkwardly. "Still, regulations are clear. He doesn't have the proper zoning or licensing to operate a communal residence." Before Jack could reply, Mason stepped forward, his voice carrying that old command tone of a soldier who'd had enough. "Ma'am," he said, "this man's done more for the broken than any of your offices ever will. You see those men over there?" He pointed to Luke and Ethan, who stood by the fire pit. "They came here half dead. Now they're working, eating, living. You're looking at a miracle built out of scrap wood and decency." The clearing went still. Even the wind seemed to pause. Wella looked at Jack, then at the sign nailed above the porch, "The shelter for those who've been left behind." Her voice softened. "Mr. Mercer, why did you build this?" Jack exhaled slowly. "Because some of us don't have anywhere else to go. And when the world forgets you, you either disappear, or you build something worth remembering." For a long moment, the inspector said nothing. Then she closed her clipboard. "We'll need to do some paperwork," she said finally. "But I don't see any reason this can't be recognized as a private homestead and community initiative. As long as it meets safety codes, it can stay." Jack blinked, barely believing it. "You mean," she smiled faintly, "you mean your home, Mr. Mercer?" As the SUVs rolled away, Mason slapped Jack on the shoulder. "Told you," he said. "All it needed was sunlight." Jack looked out over the clearing, the lake shimmering in the distance. Rex lying by the porch, Nova nosing through the grass. He felt something shift inside him, something that had been locked away for years. For the first time since he'd built it, the shelter wasn't just his refuge. It was official, recognized, real. He looked down at Rex, who lifted his head, tail thumping once against the floorboards. "We made it, partner," Jack murmured. "We finally belong." And above them, the wooden sign creaked softly in the wind, like the voice of the mountain itself, whispering back home.
The first light of morning slid over the ridge like a quiet promise. It spilled across the valley, brushed the roof of the shelter, and finally reached the old porch where Jack Mercer sat, the same porch he'd built with his own calloused hands decades ago. His hair was silver now. His shoulders, once carved from labor and loss, had softened, but his eyes, those weathered blue eyes, still carried that steady calm, like the lake beyond the trees that never forgot how to reflect the sky. He sat in his worn chair, a wool blanket over his knees, watching as the mist lifted from the garden. The world around him had changed, and yet somehow, here, everything remained the same. A soft thump came from beside him. Rex lay curled at Jack's feet, muzzle white as frost, breathing slow, deep, and steady. Time had gentled him too. The proud shepherd that once barked at thunder now only stirred at birdsong. Jack reached down, brushing his fingers through Rex's fur. The dog's tail moved, barely a lazy wag that said more than words ever could. "Easy, boy," Jack whispered. "We're still here." From the edge of the clearing came another sound, lighter, brisker. Nova trotted in from the woods, dew clinging to her coat, eyes bright with the kind of energy that only the young can keep. She carried the same posture Rex once had, alert, loyal, protective. Jack smiled. "Good girl, Nova, keeping watch." She gave a small bark, bounding up the steps and resting her head on Rex's flank. The old dog stirred, lifted his head just enough to nuzzle her. A quiet exchange, one generation to the next. The cabin door opened behind them. A young man, early 20s, tanned, wearing a patched flannel, stepped out, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "Morning, Jack." Jack nodded. "Taking one. You're up early, kid." The boy smiled. "Couldn't sleep. Thought I'd get the fire going." Jack looked at him for a long moment. That same spark, the one he'd once seen in Mason, in Luke, in the broken men who'd found their way here, burned behind those eyes. "Hope you'll make a good caretaker," Jack said softly. The young man hesitated. "Caretaker?" Jack's gaze drifted toward the wooden sign hanging over the porch. The years had faded the paint, but the words were still clear. "The shelter for those who've been left behind," except now. Beneath it, a new line had been carved by hand, "Where the lost come home." He smiled faintly. "This place needs someone who remembers what it's for. When I'm gone, promise me you'll keep it that way." The boy nodded. "You're not going anywhere yet." Jack chuckled. "Maybe not today." He looked at the horizon, the sun climbing higher, painting gold over the lake. "But when I do, I'll be right here, in the walls, the soil, maybe even in the bark of that old oak." The boy followed his gaze. The oak stood tall at the heart of the clearing, branches wide as arms beneath it. Dozens of small wooden crosses dotted the earth, markers for men, women, and animals who had once called the shelter home. A silence fell between them, not heavy, just full. Later, when the boy went off to tend the garden, Jack stayed on the porch. He leaned back, coffee cooling in his hand, and closed his eyes. The sounds of morning wrapped around him, the wind whispering through pine, Nova's soft panting, the faint hum of bees waking to the sun. He thought of the years behind him, the cold nights when the fire burned too low, the faces of those he'd buried, the laughter of those who had stayed. Every scar on his hands had a story. Every plank of wood in this place carried someone's name. And through it all, Rex had never left his side. Jack looked down again. The old shepherd's eyes were hot, staring somewhere far away. "Hey, Jack," murmured. "You still with me, partner?" Rex's ear twitched. Jack smiled through the ache rising in his chest. "We've come a long way, haven't we? From the snow to this." He paused, watching the sunlight crawl across the porch, then, softly, almost to himself, he said, "We stayed long enough to see the light." Rex's eyes fluttered once, slow and peaceful. The moment stretched tender, eternal, until the old dog exhaled one last time, a sigh that sounded like rest. Jack didn't move for a while. He just sat there, his hand resting on Rex's back, feeling the warmth fade under his palm. When he finally looked up, the sunrise was in full bloom, the whole valley awash in gold. Nova lifted her head, sensing something, and pressed herself against Jack's leg. He stroked her neck gently. "It's all right, girl," he whispered. "He's home now." The young man returned a little later to find Jack still sitting there, eyes on the horizon. "Jack?" he asked quietly. Jack didn't answer. The boy knelt beside him, seeing the faint smile frozen on the old man's face, the kind that only comes when a man has nothing left to fight, and everything left to give. Behind them, the wind stirred. The sign above the porch creaked softly. "Where the lost come home." Nova stood at the edge of the porch, ears perked toward the sunrise. For a heartbeat, in that trembling light, it looked as if 3 figures stood there together, man, old dog, and the young guardian beside them, their shadows merging into one long, gentle silhouette. And as the day broke fully over the shelter, the valley came alive once more. The boy lifted his face to the warmth. Nova barked once, short and bright, the sound echoing through the trees like a promise renewed. Somewhere, carried on the wind, a voice seemed to linger, rough, kind, and steady. "We're home, Rex. We made it." And the sun rose higher, spilling over the mountains, soft, golden, infinite. The shelter glowed beneath it, alive with light, where the lost had come home, and where hope would always begin again.